Hello, everybody. How you doing? My name's Eric Rosenfeld. On-campus students, I know we just chatted, but let me just introduce myself to the online students just for a minute. Welcome. My name's Eric Rosenfeld. I'm the program director for Digital Art and Design and Graphic Design, and we're going to be talking about Illustrator, Photoshop, and I call this the 5 things. And let me just re-log in. There we go. I call this just the 5 things about Illustrator and Photoshop. Okay. How many of you have been using Photoshop for a while? Okay. Just usually a number of you. Go from there. How many of you have been using Illustrator? Okay. A few less, but usually there's a good number for this. Easy programs? Complicated programs? What do you think? Yeah, I mean, they're easy, they're complicated. The way I always describe all of the Adobe applications is they're never complicated, they're just deep. Right? The only reason they seem complicated is because they're very deep and you can do lots of things with them. And really, they're designed just to assist you with your creativity. They're not designed to really do anything for you, right? So often they can seem complicated because it's not working, or you're trying to use something and you're not exactly sure why that is. So what we do here is, I'm going to call this the 5 things, is I have 5 examples in Illustrator, 5 examples in Photoshop of just techniques that I use all the time. These are sort of generic techniques that I use for illustration and for graphics. I'm not going to do so much as painting and digital painting. I'm actually not very good at it. But we're going to be, focusing on design and graphics and illustration work. But these are techniques to add interest to your graphics. And these are techniques I use in Illustrator and Photoshop all the time. So I'm not going to be going so much through the step-by-step of the basic tools. But what I figured is, while I'm doing something, any chance I get to explain a basic tool, I'll do that. So while we're in the middle of a demo and we need let me just go and explain how a gradient works really quick. All right, then we talk about a gradient. All right, sound good? Online sound good? All right, I heard you. So I do have files for you to have. I have an Illustrator file and Photoshop file, so you're welcome to follow along with what I'm doing. I'm going to move at kind of a quick pace, so this is going to be less of a workshop and more of just a show and see. But you're welcome to kind of goof around with the files as I'm going through. I'm just not going to wait for completion or wait for people to finish. But you can see it's just tinyurl.com/FOA for Full Sail Online, or Full Sail on Air. FOA, 5 things may, to go from there. So it's about 170 meg download, so shouldn't take terribly long. Ready to begin? I think I asked that already. All right, let's go. So I'm inside Illustrator. By the way, let me go ahead and open up that folder that you have here. We'll have an Illustrator file, 5 things Illustrator, 5 things Photoshop. So I'm going to start up with Illustrator. And in both Illustrator and in Photoshop, I'm going to be using the layers to go from example to example, right? So if you open up the file and it's the wrong thing, or you're not sure what is happening, just always check your layers. In Photoshop particularly, you can't do anything in Photoshop without layers. And in Illustrator, layers are still very important. They're a little less important because we have a thing called stacking order, which I'll get into. So what we're going to do here is I'm just going to grab our table of contents. We're going to go through just some varying stroke width example. This is something a lot of people don't do in Illustrator, so I figured it's a good thing to do. We're going to use gradients for color and light, layer masks for transitions between graphics. That's something you normally do in Photoshop, but we're going to do it in Illustrator because we have opacity masks in Illustrator, which are pretty cool. We're going to use blends for depth, and I decided right before here we're going to do my waffle example that I haven't done in years. So we're going to make waffles today. Should be either interesting or a giant fireball of badly looking illustrated waffles. And then we're going to use gradient meshes for shading. So we're going to go 5 quick examples along the way. We'll talk about the pen tool. Along the way, we'll talk about stacking order, gradients, fill, stroke. So even if you've never used this software before, you'll hear all the things that you'll want to start learning about if you've never used the software. All right? And then also along the way, if I show something that is radically amazing, you can give me a woohoo, or you can proclaim your love for me, either one. Or 2 is, if you have a question or it's confusing, just shout out, hey, I need an explanation for that, and I'll dive a little bit deeper. All right? So we'll jump right in. If I go to 0, my layer, 0, 1 stroke width, I have a couple examples here. And by the way, if you're completely new to Illustrator, Illustrator is a resolution-independent vector drawing program, meaning everything we draw in Illustrator is resolution Independent, it means we can size it up, we can scale it up, we can zoom in to 64,000%, and any more, and we'd split atoms and explode, so it's a good thing they limit that. Go from there, that joke is at least 20 years old, it's great. Go from there. And but the reason we use Illustrator for so much of our work is because it's a drawing tool. It's the best drawing tool. It's not a painting tool, it's more of a drawing tool, but we sketch our ideas down on a piece of paper, we'll scan them in, bring them in, and then use the pen tool to make everything. So just a really quick introduction to that pen tool. If I go grab my pen tool over here, and if I'm on the right layer, with my pen tool, you create Bezier curves, so this is good knowledge for a geek version of Jeopardy, if you're ever in one. And so I just click and drag, and every path has anchor points and control handles. So I can come in here and move the anchor points. I can use my direct select tool to grab individual anchor points. I can use my black arrow to grab the entire shape and move it around. And really, if you're brand new to Illustrator, it just takes a weekend. Just takes a weekend of messing with the pen tool, struggling with it, wrestling it to the ground, making it your tool. And then after that, it gets really, really, really easy using the pen tool. Those of you who've been using Illustrator before, you know, though, that first weekend using the tool, there's some interesting language that comes out of your mouth when it doesn't do what you want it to do. Just takes a weekend, takes practice, and after that, with the pen tool, you can draw any shape or curve or straight line in the existence of the universe. Well, I mean, in a three-dimensional and two-dimensional plane, right? No fourth-dimensional shapes. And wow, that's the geekiest joke I think I've ever told. And but with the pen tool, there's one thing I always point out with the pen tool and with shapes in Illustrator, just because it's not like apparent with the interface. And that's if I want to grab an individual point, so I'm going to delete that. And let's say I just make a circle. All right, so I take the circle, and I want to move one of those anchor points down. I want to make it more of an ellipse rather than a circle. And I grab my direct select tool, because Eric told you that direct select tools are used for moving individual points. So I take that, and I start moving it, and it moves the whole thing. And so you hit Command-Z, undo, and then you do it again, and you do it again. And then around 2 a.m., some colorful language comes to your mouth. It's like, Eric lied to me. Eric sucks, right? Go from there. That's because in Illustrator, when you have all the points selected, all the points are always going to move. So right now, all the points are selected. It's really small, and as I get older, they get smaller. But if I click off and then just click on where the point was going to be, now I have just that one point selected, and then I can move that point. That is the number one most frustrating thing in Illustrator. So I always like to point that out as much time as possible. Those of you who've been using Illustrator for a while, you know that's like the first thing you always have to do. You just have to, if you have the whole object selected, you just have to click off and then go grab that point. And now with the new versions, they even give you little guides to kind of, it'll pop up when you're on it, and now you can move that point. The second most frustrating thing in Illustrator is just stacking order, and this is like really easy to get over, right? So if I take just one more shape, there's not enough stars. And by the way, you just never use the lens flare tool. There's not, J.J. Abrams himself wouldn't use that lens flare tool, all right? And he's a big fan of them, right? This is basically a Illustrator engineer going, let's make a tool that nobody should ever use in their entire life, right? So just ignore it, never use it. It's not a good idea, all right? But stars, there we go. On the other hand, stars are great. All right, so I make one star, and I'm just going to color it with my fill, and I'll make another shape. I'll make a circle, and again, let me just color that. And I'll make one more. Let's make a triangle. Use my arrow tools. Bring that in. All right, a very muted RGB. All right, so I have three shapes here. Stacking order in Illustrator just means nothing ever gets overwritten, right? Everything's on the same layer right now. And in fact, if I go to my layers palette inside Illustrator, I can click down and actually see every shape that's on that layer. You rarely have to do that. You really only have to do this if you're having problems. There's something wrong and you have to go in there and dissect a compound path or something strange going on. But if I come in here, just leave my layers alone. In fact, most of the time I'll hide my layers and I'll have something new called properties up. Properties is like the new panel that replaces all the other panels in Illustrator. It's brand new to the 2018, and I love it. It's great. All right, so if I take one of these shapes and I want that triangle to be behind the circle, I just go to Object, Arrange, Send Backwards, right? Now, if you have 1,000 shapes on that layer, you might have to send backwards a couple times, to get it to go where you want it to go. Or you might just say Object, Arrange, Send to Back, and then it goes all the way to the front. And then you might say Object, Arrange, bring forward one. Might need to do that a couple times. And this is when your hotkeys are very handy. In fact, if you're thinking about getting your first Adobe hotkey tattoo, command brackets. It's a nice little one on, of course, if you do a command bracket, yeah, you want it facing you. You wouldn't want it facing out. Go from there. So we say, command brackets. That way you can send objects forward and backwards very easily with that stacking order. Okay, so pen tool, direct select, stacking order. If you're brand new to Illustrator, as we do these more advanced examples, you'll see me using this stuff all the time. Questions, comments, insults? Yeah.
Could we have the URL for your files again, please?
There we go. And I'll leave it up for a second.
That would be great. Thank you.
So it's tinyurl.com/FOA 5 things may. And we'll give it a 10 count. Or you can take a screenshot of it, I guess, if you're typing frantically. FOA 5 things may. Are you putting it in the message window?
Trying to. It's
Okay.
not working. That's why I wanted you to pull it back up.
What it should, let me just go ahead and jump to it. I'm going to go ahead and pull up a browser. Give it a second. This is Microsoft's OneDrive. You can please ignore the Mac OS file. That's just a OneDrive Mac incompatibility thing. But basically, you can just select the layer and you can click download, and it'll download.
Yeah, they're good.
Right there.
Thank you again for that.
Cool. All right. I'm glad they asked. Perfect. All right, so we have, I'll go ahead and delete those files. So, so this example is about stroke and stroke width, and how varying your stroke width is a really simple way to get your illustration work to be a little bit more interesting than just basic lines. When you're brand new to Illustrator and you're struggling with a pen tool, you're trying to figure it out, you tend to draw everything with a 1-point stroke on it. It's super even, and then you're just happy that you were able to produce that. But then after a couple months, you'll go back and look at your stuff and go, yeah, that brain is not very interesting. How can I make that brain more dynamic, more interesting? Well, let me vary the stroke and change the way the line works. Line is such an important art concept, and you have a tool here that allows you to master the line and control every pixel of it, which is great. So very quickly, let's go grab one more star. If I hit the letter D, that's a nice shortcut for default fill and stroke. And let me go ahead and bring up my stroke palette, which currently I have docked over here. I'm going to go ahead and pull it out and expand it. There we go. And while I'm there, I'm going to go ahead and pull out my color palette, because you tend to use those side by side. So I'm going to go ahead and lock them together. You can drag things around. Oops. There we go. I don't need color guide. I'll just start with those two. And I'll leave those up for a lot. You might see me then, when I get tired of them, I might drag them over and lock them to the guide over here. But for right now, I want them open. All right. So zoom in. So I'll grab the star. And again, by default, if I hit the letter D, default 1-point stroke, you can see I can change the stroke. as thick or as a thin. But there's a lot of little options here that not a lot of people take advantage of. One here is a line stroke. It's really small on the screen, but you can see this is actually, I can align the stroke to the inside of the path, or I can align the stroke to the outside of the path, so you can see it changed where the stroke falls. That's really handy when you're wanting to create and in fact, we'll do that in a second. I want to create like a big, thick stroke around a very complicated object. I'll use that technique quite a bit. And then also, your butts and caps, right? You always want to change those. So if I come in here and I just have a line, I can come in here and rather than having just a straight line there, I have some basic controls. I can make a nice rounded edge. You're not really going to do much more than that. So if you want to get more precise about that, about that ending of that line, you would then go up to Object, and you would just say Expand. And I can expand the fill, or expand the stroke, and now I actually have just a path. I have a path all the way around. So there's a lot of little tricks you can do with that. But right now, I'm going to leave it as a stroke. So I'm going to come over here, and with this brain, what I like to do when I'm not sure how to handle line is I like to vary the line width, and I'll go kind of thick to thin. I'll kind of do thicker strokes on the outside, and I'll work my way to thinner on the inside, but it just depends on what you're doing. So if I have this brain here, and I want to, let's see here, examples. And I want to alter these widths. Right now you can see I have a lot, they're all kind of individual lines, which are kind of hard to deal with. Also notice I have it grouped, right? So that whole object there is grouped. In fact, if I take my black arrow and just click on it, all those individual lines are selected. That's something I meant to mention earlier. Illustrator a little while ago created something called group isolation mode, which is really, really, really handy. All right, if you've been using Illustrator for a while and you haven't been using group isolation mode, you're in for a treat here. So if I have a group of shapes, I can double click on it, and notice it creates a gray bar across the top. That just tells you, okay, I even have a breadcrumb navigation across the top. And I can say, okay, now I'm in group isolation mode. Now when I click on it, I have just one path selected. Okay, so rather than having to ungroup it and then regroup it, I can just zoom in. And in fact, I can have group within group within group, and I can just keep double clicking on it and zoom in to group isolation mode. And then when I'm done, I just go up to this bar across the top, double click, and I'm out of that group. In fact, if I zoom out and I double click on it, see now it's still grouped. Everything else grays out, and you focus just on that group. I ignored that feature when it first came out because I'm like, oh, I don't need to use this. And then I started using it, and it's a wonderful, life-improving experience. All right, so now what I'm going to do is rather than just having these lines all the same, I'm going to use my stroke width tool here. They actually have a tool here for varying your stroke width, because by default, if I come in here, and again, I'm going to zoom into group isolation mode, and if I come in here and I want to change that path, I can make that thicker, but it doesn't quite taper. It doesn't kind of line up with the other strokes. I could take the whole thing and make it a little bit thicker. But what's nice about that group width tool, but I am going to come in here and change the end cap. There we go. That's a little bit nice. It doesn't have that hard edge. But I can come in here with my width tool, which is right here. Width tool. It's right above the warp tool. You don't tend to use these very often, but I'll use the width tool quite a bit. And I'll zoom in. And what's cool about the width tool is it allows me to vary my stroke width without changing the stroke. Meaning I can change the appearance of the stroke, but it doesn't turn it into, I'm not having to create outlines or create a path. So I can come in here now, click and drag, and I can change that to a thick to a thin stroke, and you can see it just it's actually using the gradient mesh engine. If you know about Illustrator, it's using the gradient mesh engine on top of the appearance of that stroke. But I can come in now and kind of do a thick to thin. Helps if I zoom in. That's weird. There you go. Something like that. And if it's a little too bulbous, which is a fun word to say in front of people. say it. It's kind of a funny word, bulbous. All right. And so now I have that control, but check this out. It's still just one line if I go move that anchor point. If I just move that anchor point, there we go. If I just move that anchor point, hold on. Man, I am not clicking on the right things. There you go. But you can see I can bend my path, I can change my path, and then the appearance of it just goes as well. So it's a really nice tool. I can just come through, click and drag, and change thick to thin, kind of in any direction I want. Wow, that was a little strange one, but I'll leave it. It's not, sometimes you'll just still have to draw shapes with the pen tool, and there's also brushes, but I find I use the width tool a lot more than I used to, and I use brushes less because it gives you so much control. Does that make sense? Thumbs up? All right. Now, if I just come down here a little bit to this one, this is more of a logo design type example. And it just gives me an opportunity to kind of go through some basics as well as we dive into our next one, which is going to be gradients. So for this one here, notice I want to have it kind of like a cutout on that background shape. So I drew all the shapes. You can see I didn't do it. Whoa, wrong brain. I didn't do a tremendous job. Even notice like my little fire here is a bit. So let's go ahead and fix that right now. That our little fire thrust is off angle, and you can tell I was being a little sloppy with that. So if I delete that, I'm just going to make a triangle, not a star. I know my shapes. There you go, triangle. And I'll just rotate it, use my selection tool, go around to the edge. If you hold down Shift, it'll snap to 45 and 90 degrees and 180 degree angles. And then I'll come in here, and because I want to have this thing absolutely perfect, I'll just grab my pen tool, add a point. Oops, if I can see it properly, and I'll just move that up top. There we go, and then I'll just grab those two. There's a million ways you can control shape. Whoa! That's what you say when you have the wrong thing selected. All right, I'm just gonna, there you go, that'll work for now. 1, 2. All right, so when this happens, drag it away, because I kept dragging on the wrong thing. So now I can just make a selection across the top. There we go, make that shape that way I wanted. Just using a basic triangle. I'll shrink it a little bit, and then drag it back. All right, now, this actually is a nice little reason to show you a nice shortcut. Command 2 is another nice tattoo to get maybe on the underside of your arm for your Adobe hotkeys. Command 2 is lock, okay? So you're getting angry. I was getting angry with Illustrator because I kept clicking by mistake on the wrong one, and it was selecting it, and then I was getting frustrated. So I take that shape, I'm done with the thrust, now I want to deal with the background. I'll just hit Command 2, and it locks whatever is selected. It locks your selection. Now I can't click on it by accident. It's going to be there so I can use it as reference, but it will not move. And then when I'm done, I just go to Object, Unlock All, which its hotkey used to be Command Shift 2, and then they removed it with the latest version, so they wanted to use it for something else. So if you wanted to have a hotkey for that one, you'd actually have to set it up yourself in the hotkey preferences. But I can hit Unlock All, and now that's back. So I hit Command 2 all the time just to lock it down, and now I can come in, and if I want to deal with, excuse me, one second. If I want to deal with that background shape, I want to cut out the clouds, or the thrust clouds. That's the technical term. If I take, again, I'll have to zoom into group isolation mode. I'll take, let's do it one more time. There we go. So now I have the cloud selected, and I'll select that background. And that gives me an opportunity to bring up the Pathfinder palette. So I go to Window, Pathfinder. Pathfinder is used for subtracting shapes from the front and the back. I never know what any of these icons mean. I just roll over them and it says unite, minus front, intersect. Oh, probably minus front will probably do. So I hit minus front. And now you can see it gave me what I wanted. It's subtracted those clouds from or the smoke and thrust stuff from that circle. But now it's in the foreground just because it jumped to the foreground. So then we just select that shape and I'll send it to the back. Command Shift brackets or Object Arrange, send it back. And now we have, it's getting the way we want it. All right. Now this example is about stroke and stroke width. So right now, again, you can see all these elements are the same stroke and stroke width. So I'm going to go ahead and take my rocket here. And again, I got to double click so I can select just the rocket. I'll add the stroke, maybe 3, go from there. Now, there's a little bit of a trick in this example because I have a window that you can see through to the sun, which you would actually ask yourself, why would you want to see through a rocket ship? Like that seems like an error in rocket ship design. But for this logo, we want to see through that gradient. And if I come in here and I use something called a compound path, I can cut a hole in this, pretty easily. But it creates a problem. So if I make my porthole, that is not a porthole. That would be an alien porthole. There you go, circle. If I came in here, set up my circle, selected both, and I just said Object, Compound Path, Make, it's actually going to take the circle and cut it into that shape, right? But the problem is now that porthole has to have the same stroke width as their outside shape. Like if I come in here and I change its width, you can see the whole thing works. So often when I'm doing logo design like this, I don't actually cut a hole. I'm going to hit undo. There you go. I don't actually cut a hole in the shape. Let's say I come in here and I'm going to, let's just add a gradient across the background. And I want to kind of have a gradient. I want to see through to that gradient. I'll just fake it. I'll make a circle. And that can have a different stroke. And I'll take that gradient, and I'll just use my gradient tool to resize that gradient. Come on. And they updated it. It is very useful the way they changed the gradient tool recently. I'm just not used to it. So I'll just come in here and adjust the colors on that top shape to make it look like you're seeing through to the shape behind it, rather than dealing with cutouts and things like that. So just stack your orders, stack your objects, and you go from there. But again, now we can come in, I can grab, all these guys, which I wish I had grouped them together. Hold on, I thought I did. Nope, I didn't group them together, so let's just pretend I did. Again, coming in here, maybe I'll change those to very thin lines, or if I need to make them, a lot more vibrant, change the stroke, to very emphatic. So your control of line and your control of your stroke on your objects really makes a difference to the style and interest somebody will show in your graphics. Okay, so if you're brand new to Illustrator, just never forget about stroke. Agreed? Questions, comments, insults? Online, are we good? All right. So, I'm going to bypass that heart because that's just a really badly drawn heart. But it's basically just showing you the width tool again. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into number 2, which is gradients. All right, I'm going to go to my other layer. Just gradients for color and light. And you can see I also gave you a list of core tools to learn for this example. So free transforms, really handy. Linear and radial gradients, we're going to talk about swatches. And we'll use some blending modes for this as well. So gradients are really powerful, but they can be used for evil. For example, if I make a new document, and let's make our techno rave flyer to the bibliothèque. So we'll come in here, and I just, put a gradient in there for our fill. By default, it's like, black and white, but I can pull up my gradient palette, and I can even go to my swatches. Let me pull up swatches. And, like there's a lot of obnoxious. They actually removed the rainbow gradient, which I'm disappointed because it was the most vibrant and like in-your-face obnoxious gradient that was in here. And I use it because I'd use it for all my examples so that students would never use it because it was just so, it had like pure black, pure white, RGB in there. It was not a pretty gradient in there. But so now we have to make our own if we want to make something obnoxious. So I'll come in here and just to show you the gradient palette, I can come in here and take any gradient, and these little boxes, these stops, they hold my color, so I can actually just select a stop and then select the color, and then I can even adjust that stop to how it's going to control that gradient. And you learn gradients in Illustrator, they're the same in Photoshop, technically they're the same in After Effects, InDesign, things like that. So I'll come in here, make another one, pure white, make another one, let's go pure red. Oh, that's even worse, that like kind of orangish. Let's see, how garish can we make it? Let's see, maybe a yellow in there. All right, so just because you have great power to use every color doesn't mean you should, from black to white to red to green. Also, because again, with great power comes great responsibility. But even worse, you do have the ability you can't put gradients by default in your type, but if I create my outlines, if I go to type and I just say create outlines, I'm losing it. Command-Shift-O is the hotkey. And I've used the hotkey. Oh, there we go, right there. Sorry, create outlines. And now I can put a gradient in there. So gradients in backgrounds are really hard, and gradients in type are really hard visually. So if you're ever going to do gradients in type, you actually want to take that gradient.
Question.
Yeah.
Is expanding and then creating outlines the same thing then?
Yes. Well, technically, yes. The question was, is expanding a shape and creating outlines the shape the same? It's just creating outlines only affects type. So if you have a shape that you want to expand to something, you go to Object Expand. If you have type that you want to just turn the type into a path, you use Create Outlines for that. And if you're delivering a file to somebody and you know they don't have your font, create outlines out of all your type. Otherwise, Photoshop or Illustrator will default to like Myriad on all your type to go from there. So if you're going to deliver something to a client, you create outlines for them, or you always deliver the font with your file if you've paid for it and all that fun stuff. All right, good question. Other questions? All right, so again, just be careful with these gradients. But right now, the style of design out there is really interesting. You're seeing lots of gradients. Like we're kind of transitioning from a pure flat style of design. Like I started in this industry in the 90s. I was listening, in the 90s it was the height of grunge, Creed, and Nirvana. You had two types of grunge musicians, and I won't tell you who I was listening to. Might not have been the cool one in retrospect, but it was all about texture and shadows, and we're all like wearing our flannel, and I was designing websites with texture and things like that. There's a few out there. I'm just gonna pretend you guys remember this. And so that's when I was learning about design. That's when I was learning about computer. Well, I've been a computer geek my whole life, but I was learning about graphics and art, and I have a million bleeding fonts that get home that I can never use because it's just not the style right now. And then the pendulum swang a little bit, and we've been doing flat style of design for a long time, where it was very, very minimal. Google led the charge, Apple kind of led the charge. And you were seeing lots of just flat, maybe fake shadows that were just pen tooled. And now we're getting to a lot more of a vibrant style of illustration. It's a lot of fun to see. You're seeing gradients being used, your basic shadows, but it's not realism. It's just really interesting pastels are really here in force. So you can see, for example, like this one here. This has a little image that has just a lot of different gradients in it, but they're very subtly made, and they're being used for kind of realistic shading, but not not hyper realistic. They're just trying to add interest rather than going completely flat, and you're seeing this quite a bit. So just to kind of dive into gradients, I have this example. Actually, you know what? Let's do this one. So I have my little kind of like fake DAD for Digital Arts and Design logo here. And if I take any of these shapes, you can see I already have them broken up with my selection tool. If I grab them with my black arrow, again, notice it grabs the entire shape. So if I want to zoom in, I just double click, and it zooms in onto that shape. But if I take any of these colors, let's grab this one, and I'm just going to mix up my color palette. Nice little shortcut for you is, where'd my color palette go? Is right now, my color mode that I'm mixing in is grayscale, and I don't want that. If I hold down Shift and click on this little bar in my color panel, it changes to RGB. HSB, hue, saturation, and brightness, which is a really handy way of mixing color. CMYK, all tried and true. And then you can just kind of flip through RGB, grayscale, go from there. So you just shift click your little color bar down there, and it's really handy. So like often I'll come in here and I'll mix up my color in RGB if I'm in RGB mode. Oops, helps if I grab just one of those shapes. All right, and then I'll shift click to HSB because HSB has this brightness slider, so I can come in here and very easily change the brightness of that color, and then I can create tints, tones, and shades really easily, all based off the same color of green, and it gives a nice, nice different sort of varied color palette, but it's all using the same color. So now if I come in here and I want to give it a gradient, I just click my gradient button. And of course it replaces your color. So if I really like that color, I'll drag that color down into my swatches, and that way it's just saved. And now I can come in here, click my gradient, pull up my gradient palette over here, and I can actually just, click and drag that green over there. And often this is what I'll do is I'll come in here and if I option drag, it drags a copy of that color. So I'll just drag two of the same color here. We don't want to go pure black. Like going green, oops. There you go, I just double clicked on it. Going like green to pure black, that's a wide range of color. I want to go green, pardon me. Green to just a slightly darker green. So again, I'll just drag my little swatch over with green, make that one a little darker, double click on it, shift click over to HSB mode. There we go. And then I'll hit G for my gradient tool, or I'll just click it, but I can never see it anymore. There we go, gradient tool. And I can just click and drag and control that gradient in that shape. All right, and then from there, again, if I like that, I'll just drag that swatch over, click on the next shape, use that gradient to start with, and then use my gradient tool to reshape it to create just slight shifts in color, or maybe I'll have it go the opposite direction. So you kind of get this little peak that happens because you're shading and lighting. And there, actually, you'd probably want to go like this, then have the highlight this way. Oops. Again, here we go. There we go. So I have the highlight in the middle. Then I'll grab this one and do something like that. There we go. And even I still have the stroke in there to define the shape. I now have this sort of three-dimensional shape because I have a highlight running down the center. It's not perfect. It's not bent. That's a whole nother example we'll do with gradient meshes, but it's getting there. Okay, so basic gradients, moving them around, really, really, really handy. Now, what I have over here is just an example of how easy it is to create depth with gradients. All right, so if I have, again, I'll just zoom in. I have our tooth. and I give this a gradient. Very basic. Green tooth, maybe not the best color choice for dental work, but that'll work. And again, so I have that. I'm going to drag this guy back in place. That you can tell that was just drawn with a pen tool, just to create this little curvature. I'm going to get rid of the stroke, and I want the same gradient. Now, let's say I didn't have it as a swatch. I can always go grab my eyedropper, letter I on your keyboard, and I can shift click. And if I if I just click with my eyedropper, it's going to sample the fill and the stroke. It's not going to sample the color. If I shift click, it'll sample just the color that you're hitting. So it'll just be one shape here. But if I come in here like in my gradient and I want to shift click over here, it'll grab that color that I'm clicking on. But if I click, it'll actually grab the gradient and put it in the shape. And again, so now that I have that gradient, all I have to do is change it a little bit. Double click. Again, I'll just go over to HSB, make it a little brighter. I'll make this one a little darker. Oops, that's not what I wanted. Undo. Run away. There you go. There we go. And then again, just use my gradient tool to reshape that. Whoa. Did some funkiness. There we go. And again, I'll remove the stroke. Come on, little buttons. And now you're getting this sense of, well, dental decay at this point, really. But but there's a little a divot in that shape. But it's really just throwing a very basic shape on top of it, and how quickly that gradient, because your mind is always looking for shadows and highlights. It's trying to make sense of this two-dimensional world by the three-dimensional world that you live in. All right? So that's, very quick gradients. If I come over here to this one, I always like to mention is, or let's see, which one do we want to do? Let's do this one. All right, I'm actually going to just use this one that's already done, because I'm going to mention blending modes along with gradients. If you've been using Photoshop for a while, you've definitely been using blending modes for a long time. We have them in Illustrator. They were introduced in Illustrator 9, I want to think, 9 or 10. But let's say I want to change the values in this entire object, and it's fairly complex. You can see it's just a couple gradients thrown in there, some very basic shapes. We've got a little comet going in here, and you can see even that comet is just a gradient. It's just a shape with a gradient, and it kind of fades out into the same tones in the background. Oh, you know what? While I'm here, because you asked, I heard you ask. Go for there. You said, how could you fade that comet out into transparency rather than just having it end? And so what's nice about these gradients is with this gradient tool now, you actually have an opacity option for each one of your little buckets, right? So I take this, zoom in. Let's say I don't want it to end dark. I'm gonna double click, and I'll make that brighter so you can see that end there. But I want it to fade out. I can just take that gradient bucket, change the opacity down to 0. And now that gradient has transparency in it, and it's going to fade out across that shape. Okay? They added that a little while ago. I always forget it's there. I do it the longer way with opacity masks, and I always go, you know what? I could have just used a gradient. Oops. And I manage. Oh, there it is. Go from there. So just fading out. And again, now I can come in here. I can. If I figure out why I'm not. Oh, had the wrong thing selected. All right. Oh, again, I have the whole thing grouped. I'm just going to zoom in. There we go. My file is a little big, so that's why it's chunky. Come on, I want to grab that. There we go. But I can now control with these stoppers how much is going to be transparent. So if I pull this stopper in a little bit, you can see now it's fading much more off into the distance. All right. Now, you can see how easily I get distracted. If I come in here now, if I want to just kind of alter everything, I'm just going to drag a rectangle. And I'm going to put a black and white gradient on it, like that. And I'm going to use this as a shading layer. This is something you do in Photoshop all the time, but you can do it in Illustrator as well. If I go to my transparency palette, Window, Transparency, I pull this up. We have our blending modes: multiply, color burn, overlay, screen mode, all of our friends that have been there forever. Multiply will make white transparent and will darken things. So black will be black, white will be transparent, and all the shades in between. Screen mode is the reverse. Screen will make black transparent and white opaque. So if I come in here and click multiply, you can see now all of a sudden the white has become transparent, black is still here, so I can take my gradient tool and just reshape that radial gradient to highlight or move wherever we think it should be. And I can take that shape. You can see if I pull it off, it doesn't react to the background of Illustrator, so it has to have a shape to react to. But that's just using multiply mode. I can change the color burn, and now we've really changed the drama for this. This is more of like that asteroid's coming to wipe out the dinosaurs. Here, come through here. Color burn. Then you can see screen mode. Now we have more of it is hit. But again, now we can come in here and change those shapes using gradients and your blending modes. And I didn't even mention we have opacity. So if it's too much, if I go back to multiply, if it's too much, I'll just reduce the opacity. And now we've added some lighting on top of all those gradients rather than having to change each one. We could do that in Photoshop as well, but then once we do that, it's going to pixelize everything and lock it down to an aspect ratio, to a resolution. Does that make sense? Was that worth the price of admission? That one? Pretty handy. I heard yes, because I hear things. All right. So let me just jump into number 3. You can see this is the whole point was I'm going to go from example to example and just talk about as much stuff, well, I guess that I want to talk about. And that's layer masks. We have 2 happy skulls here. And we have, in Photoshop, we have layer masks. In Illustrator, we call them opacity masks. So let me just show you how to take 2 very complex illustrations, and in Illustrator, I want to blend them together. I want to transition from the colorful skull into the black and white skull. So I'll take my skull here and overlap them. Oh, and by the way, I could take this and then just drop that in like multiply mode. And you can see I can even just with blending mode start playing around with layering graphics inside Illustrator. But instead, I'm going to come in here and just overlap them like that. And then in my transparency panel, I have a little button there called Make Mask. And when you do that, it makes a little black box or a little white box. And it's the exact same thing as a layer mask in Photoshop, except you can use vector shapes to control everything, right? So I come in here, I click Make Mask. By default, it makes everything disappear. So if you unclick Clip, it'll be there. You can see, so that little box is white, so everything's there. If it's black, it's transparent. So if I go take my pen tool, and I have to click over here into the land of transparency. This is the land of the real, land of transparency. And so I'll take my pen tool, and if I just start drawing in the land of transparency, and if I fill that shape with black, wherever it is, it's going to reveal that shape, all right? So again, this is something, you can see there's my little pen-tooled blob in my mask, and wherever it's black, it's revealing the shape in between it, okay? Still vector, still very crisp and clean, and you have a lot of control. What I'm going to do, instead of using little blobby shapes, is I'm just going to make a big box, cover the whole shape, and I'm going to fill it with a gradient. My last gradient was radial. Oops. So I'll grab my gradient tool, and I can come in here and reshape. By the way, the reason this example is cool, I think it's cool, is there was the good illustration, right? You start with bad illustration, this doesn't work. You start with like horribly drawn things. So you draw, spend time making good graphics, and these techniques will help you with it, right? But I can come in here, that's a radial gradient, or I can change the type to linear. And now we can transition in any direction we want. I'm trying to figure out which one's the creepiest. I kind of like that.
Yeah, that.
Go from there. Okay? So again, we're transitioning between two types of vector graphics. We just have them grouped, and we're using gradients in an opacity mask to fade them out. The last thing you always have to do is you just have to remember to click back to the land of the real by just clicking that box. Otherwise, you'll be locked in transparency world for the rest of your life, which is kind of a sad state of being. All right, does that make sense? I'm going to take a long swig just to let that sink in, what you can do with that. There we go, very nice. All right, we're coming here on the home stretch. Number 4, this one's even shorter, but I think we'll do waffles with this one. We'll see if we can do waffles in 30 seconds. Is using blends for depth and shadow. So let me neaten this up just a little bit. I'm going to grab my gradients, put them over here, transparency, put over here. And the blend tool is often kind of a forgotten tool inside Photoshop, Illustrator, but it's really nice. If I take two shapes, oops, helps if I'm on the right layer. I'm on no layers. There we go. If I took two shapes here, a circle, and let's do a triangle, and I select them both, take my blend tool, which is right down there, and I click on a point on each one. By default, if I can actually click, there you go. By default, Illustrator will try to create shapes in between those two other shapes, blends them together. It's because I had a black stroke and a white fill, it just gave me one shape. It's just like, oh, here you go, the blend's working, right? But if I change the color of one of these, take my direct select tool, come in here, select it, and I'll just change the color, you'll see all of a sudden, Illustrator will work a little bit harder because it's trying to blend not only the shape, but it's trying to blend the color as well. So now it's blending from green to white, and I can come in here and manipulate these points, and you'll see it's manipulating that blend. It's a live thing. If I jump in outline mode, it's actually, you can see it's just two shapes with that blend in between. So this is like, before I started doing things in a real 3D program, we would do fake 3D with blends. We would make things look extruded. Now we just jump into a 3D program and do it correctly. But there's kind of a retro style to this that looks really cool, and I'm seeing it a lot in the illustrations that are out there. By the way, I can always change things forward and backwards, so now I have the circle up front. So we can change, make this look however we want. To get to your blend options, by the way, if I select my blend, all you have to do is double click on your blend tool. And you can see we have smooth color, specified steps. You can actually control how it's going to blend between those shapes. Okay? Go from there. So if you look online, Illustrator, Blend Tool, you're going to see thousands of tutorials where they make different things. What I'm going to do here is, if I can remember how to do it, is I used to make waffle illustrations. I don't know why, but it was like, if you're going to get into illustration, the one thing I recommend is you pick a subject and you just draw it a million different ways. So if you're into apples, draw 1,000 different apples, illustrate them in every style, change styles. Don't ever do one apple the same as the other one. So a long time ago when I was learning Illustrator, I did that with waffles. I was like, let me draw as many waffles as I can. This is the one that I can remember that uses blends. So what I'm going to do is I make my waffle, and we're going to do like an Eggo style waffle. Excuse me. Here. And so not a green waffle, that would be wrong. So let's do more of a brownish waffle, and waffles don't have black lines around them, so I'm going to remove my stroke. And I'm going to use my scale tool to just scale. I have my rounded rectangle. I'm going to scale it down with a copy, so I'll hit S for my scale tool, and I'll just option drag another one in there. And again, I'll make my color a little darker. And I'm trying to think. Yeah, I think that'll work in here. Now I can do this with gradients. I think I'm going to do it with solid colors right now. I'm going to select my both shapes, grab my blend tool, and I'll click on a point on each one. All right. And now you can see it's kind of creating that rounded edge for our luscious golden toasted waffle. And so then maybe I'll do one more. I'm going to actually option drag. So now actually I have 3 shapes here that are all blended together. And I'll make that one a little bit brighter. Ooh, that's a horrible color of waffle. There we go. Let's go HSB. Let's make it a little more golden and much brighter. Okay, now that is not what I want, because I now have this sort of weirdness in there. So instead, let me go ahead and add a gradient and change our gradient colors to be a little more brown. I'll just duplicate that one, drag that one off, make that one a little darker. All right, and then again, I can come in here, use my gradient tool, reshape that however you want. But the real issue here is I have that middle shape is darker, so let me just come in, grab it. I'm going to scale this down just a little bit. I'll grab this shape, and actually, instead of making it darker, make it brighter. And I need to change my blending options. Let's just put 20 of them in there. There we go. Now it's a little bit nicer. And then finally, I need the divots, the grommets. What's the depressed syrup catching area of a waffle called? Does anybody know? Waffle holes. I've called them grommets. What are they? Waffle crevices. I think that's as good as we're going to get. So let me just change I'm holding down the arrow keys to change my rounded rectangle to be less roundy. And roundy is a technical term. Again, I'm going to come in here, just put a gradient. Going one direction. I don't know where that gray came from. Let's turn that more orange. There we go. So we have our little grommet. I could even then do a blend, but I'm just going to do this quickly because I do want to get to Photoshop really quick. So I'll just drag copies, Command D for duplicate. If I could just select everything. Here we go. I don't know what happened. Not the best waffle, but you get the idea. And then, wait, part of it is this gray.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Why didn't you? All right. I don't know what happened there. That got off. All right. And then, of course, we can take all this because we have that little blend on the outside. I'm going to group it together. I'll grab my free transform tool. And waffles in 3D are a little cooler. So if I come in here, grab free transform. Let's see here. Come on. Every now and again, there we go. I might put it in perspective and then just alter that blend a little bit to give it more depth on one edge. But basically, I don't know. This is what I always do. If you zoom out, that's one mighty fine waffle. All right. So waffle in a minute and a half to go from here. Just using blends is a little silly, but I just wanted to throw that in there. All right. Let me end with number 5, which is actually a lot more interesting. which is gradient meshes. All right. Now with gradient meshes, we actually have a mesh engine that lets you do shading and lighting and give you a lot of control. This dragon here was completed completely with gradient meshes. Okay. If I jump into outline mode, Command Y, you can actually see the mesh. It's not 3D. It's just a mesh for shading that's on that. How many of you have used gradient meshes before? Excellent. And online, I see nobody's hands online either. So you're all going to learn something here. So if I take this, and I'm going to move quickly, because this is the 5 things, and I've turned it into 1,000 things. If I take just this black shape here, and over that skull, and I go to my gradient mesh tool, which is right here, gradient mesh, I can click on it, and it basically turns that object into a gradient mesh. Now, just be aware, gradient meshes don't play well with anybody else, right? You can do blending modes, and that's about it. Gradient meshes don't blend. They don't like compound paths. They don't like, well, clipping masks will work. But they don't play very well with other tools inside Illustrator. But what's cool about this point, right now that point is black, but if I change that color to white, now you can see the outside points are all black, the inside points are all is white, and if I come in here, I can use my Bezier path to alter how it's shading. Lots and lots and lots of control. So if you do this and use your transparency palette to use your blending modes, so I'll go stick this in like multiply mode. Now I can sit here and shade on top of vector objects inside Illustrator to my heart's content, and I don't have to use just linear and radial gradients. I can come in here and control exactly how that shading is going to happen. Dramatically change your illustration. Okay? Now, if I come over here to the dragon, I've picked the easiest part for it is, you can see actually I have the arm. Did I leave the arm in here? Oh, I guess I didn't. But I want to add, basically drew pen tool, just create that arm. You can see the shading of everybody else. Now, if I take my gradient tool and click on it, it makes one point, and I can come into that point, and again, I'll change it to, HSB, make it a little brighter. And you can see I can control how that shading is. But with funky shapes, you can get funky gradient meshes. So instead of just clicking on your gradient mesh tool, undo, there we go. Instead of clicking on it, if I go up to Object, Create Gradient Mesh, it'll actually make a grid, which gives you a lot more control for your shading. Now, sometimes it's too much control. Sometimes you want it to be funky. Sometimes you want it to be more loose. But I can come in here and change my grid points. I can have 3, or I could have 20. And I can even have default appearance. So, where I want white at the top or to the edge. In this case, I'll just hit OK. And now I can come in here, and I can grab, you know what? I'm going to zoom in. There we go. So I can take these center points, take their color.
Eric, while we're doing
Yep.
Is it possible to copy and paste mesh edges, I'm sorry?
My default answer is always no with gradient meshes because they don't play well with people. However, you can copy and paste the whole shape, but you can't transfer mesh points from one object to another for that. So if I wanted more at this point, I can take my gradient mesh tool, and I can actually click and add points and manipulate the mesh that way. Now, what you could do is I can take this point. I think you can do this. Grab my eyedropper tool. There you go, an eyedropper. So if the student's asking, how do I copy colors from one mesh point to another, you could use your eyedropper tool to do that. But so you get a nice drawing, a nice illustration. You want to give it that sort of softer, painterly look, but you want to stay in Illustrator because that way it's, again, resolution independent. This is, when you zoom in like this, it gets creepy, that's serial killer dragon looking at you, that's not happy dragon. That's they know something about you and are blackmailing you, Dragon. All right. To go from there. But you get that nice softness if you just spend the time. And you can see, notice also, it's not one giant mesh. It's each shape. Even like this hand is a nice example. Each part just has a mesh. And by the way, you can also use opacity masks to fade your gradient meshes together, so that way you don't have those hard edges. Really, really handy, extremely powerful. And I find shading in Illustrator, I'm not a great traditional artist. I've been faking the ability to paint my entire career. So sometimes I'll do shading in Illustrator because I'm more mathematical. I love the gradient mesh tool for that. Questions, comments, insults? All right, how much time do we have left? 20? Okay, perfect. All right, so I kind of did that on purpose. I wanted to spend a little bit more time on Illustrator, but we're going to switch brains and do very quickly 5 things in Photoshop. All right? So I'm going to jump over to Photoshop, the Photoshop file, 5 things in Illustrator and Photoshop. And in here, you can see, if I go to my table of contents, textures with modes, compositing graphics with layer masks, adding textures with clipping groups. Number 4, I didn't plan. I just grabbed a file online and just dropped it in there and said, oh, we'll figure something out. So that will either be a great example or it'll be like waffles and be a disaster. And then finally, we'll do some very quick painting and shadows and highlights. Since I talked about painting with shadows with gradient meshes, we'll do this kind of in a similar way inside Photoshop. So really quickly, again, these are the techniques I use all the time. And the first thing I should notice is that I'm using smart objects to keep all my examples separate. So everything's in here, but if you go to like 0, 1 textures with modes, and you can see my example A is really small right here, but if I double click on the thumbnail, I zoom in and I'm in a smart object, and that smart object has all my original resolution files. It's nice and big. I change it here, and it'll update on the other one. If you don't use smart objects, you're just quite frankly not cool. Okay, you're missing out on life. Grab it and use smart objects. All right, you can see if I come here and change the layer to that, and I hit save, close it, it comes and changes that file down there. What's nice is I've scaled this way down like that. I'm not throwing away any pixels. I come in here and double click. Now I have my smart object, and I have all my nice big files here. Okay, so number 1 is super easy, is just play with blending modes. When you're making textures and you're wanting something, you go grab something online. It's not yours, right? All these I grabbed actually from online. None of them are mine. I want to make them a little bit more me and use them for something. I'll come in here and just start stacking layers and start playing with blending modes. There, I'll add another one. Overlay being kind of baby bear's porridge, like you have Papa Bear and Mama Bear, and then overlay and his or her cousins are all kind of like variations. But we can come in here and just sort of stack this in different ways. I didn't have any plan in the direction we're going. I might even come in here and maybe I'll put a little blur on that wood. Just so we don't have those planks quite as even. There we go. I have a little halftone effect in here, even if I wanted to, but I'm going to turn that one off. And I want those scratches. In there. And what's nice, again, when you're in screen mode or multiply mode or any of his or her friends here, if I hit Command L for levels, Command L for levels, I can adjust the brightness of that layer, which is in turn going to affect how much it's going to fade with it. So if I want it kind of I think the term is scratchety. Come from here. And again, I can always reduce the opacity just a little bit to get that look. But again, just stacking your layers, changing the blending modes, make it really handy to play with textures inside Photoshop. All right, so number one, out of the way. We'll save that. And you can see, oh, there it is. Now for this one, I have a couple of those textures, and I want to very quickly add those textures to this logo. Okay, so actually this is a vector smart object. It is brought in from Illustrator, so if I actually come in here and double click, it actually opens up just that shape. And it's in Illustrator, so I can change it in Illustrator, come back to Photoshop, and it changes in Photoshop. Again, smart objects are amazing. Okay, but I brought in a color with a gradient and just a basic color because it was very easy to do in Illustrator. Just to show you, because if I want to add a little texture to this logo, and I want to be a little lazy, like I could pen tool out my paths and have the perfect paths, but if I take the tragic wand, which is this tool right here, technically it's called the magic wand, but we call it the tragic wand because it usually gives you tragic results, right? And I take my tragic wand and I click on my gradient. Sometimes you'll grab the whole gradient. I might have to shift click a couple times, to make that selection. So sometimes I'll bring in a shaded gradient version of a logo, and I'll bring in a solid color, because I can come in here and just very quickly click once. Oops, if I'm on the right layer. Click once, and now I have a selection that's going to work perfectly for that. But if I take my selection, and I take, like, say, this metal layer. So I made a selection. I did, it's right there. Oops, hold on. Let me make it again. And, oops, hold on, that metal has to cover the whole thing. There we go. And I just click my layer mask button one time. Bloop. What it does is it turns your selection into a mask, and it first perfectly fits on that shape. So now I can take that metal piece, move it wherever I want to move it over here. And again, now I can play with blending modes. Right? So if I have a vector shape, but it's too clean, it's too much like Illustrator, I want to bring it into Photoshop, but I still want to have that kind of crispness of a vector graphic. I can come in here, just add a little bit, reduce its opacity sometimes just a tiny bit. And again, what's cool is I'll duplicate that and just bring it down to this one. All right, now that one didn't quite fit because it wasn't the right shape. So I'll just throw away my mask. Grab my tragic wand tool. Make my selection. Oops, I have to move it over here again. Make my selection. I will. There you go. I just kept being on the wrong layer. Click my mask button. Bam. Move it over. Just adds a little bit of texture to there. Just a tiny bit, but again, you try with halftone colors or papers. Paper textures work great with vector objects because it kind of gives you, again, just a little bit more of a natural feel. And that's where the style of graphics are these days. It's just adding a tiny bit of realism back into the flat style that we've been doing for years. Does that make sense? All right, jump in really quick. I'm going to close that. I'll jump over to number 2 because we have like 10 minutes. Compositing graphics. So again, this is another smart object. I'll just double click on my hands. And I'm going to use layer masks again to get these layers interacting. The reason to bring graphics into Photoshop is to get them to interact with each other, add lighting, add shading, all that other fun stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'll first go into my hands layer and get rid of the white. And in this case, I am going to use the tragic wand because it's a pure white background. It's going to work. If it wasn't a pure white background, I would take my pen. Yeah, it's actually not. That wasn't good. Let me reduce my tolerance. There we go. There you go. But if I didn't have a perfect white background, I would take my pen tool, and pen tool, it would take me 5 minutes, and pen tool perfectly around that hand to make it a selection, okay? I'm using the tragic wand tool just because I want to make a quick example here. So I click my mask button, it turned my selection into the mask. It often gives you the opposite of what you want. You just hit Command-I for invert. Invert those colors, save it, close it. Now we're kind of getting there. But now we have like that Full Sail logo, and it just doesn't quite look like you're holding, this is kind of a creepy thing to do on camera. It doesn't quite hold, it's not holding that logo because those pinkies are behind the logo, right? And there's no way of saying pinkies go in front of the logo. Like if I grab my hand layer, it's just gonna take the whole thing. Like Photoshop doesn't know those are pinkies. So what I'm gonna do is just use my mask and just very quickly, and I'm not even gonna use my tablet here. I'm just gonna hit my mask, grab a black brush. So I hit B for brush, and I'll flip-flop to get a black color in there. Your bracket tools change your brush size. And I'll just come in here and, make sure I'm in the wrong thing. Do this to my logo layer. There we go. I want to erase my logo to reveal the pinkies underneath. All right? Layer masks are the perfect compositing tool when you're in Photoshop. All right? Now I'm using my mouse, so it's not the cleanest. I might, go a little too far. So I just hit X and paint white back. All right? Now again, I might use my pen tool to make this a perfect selection, but we're going to zoom out and be like, man, that looks perfect. Go from there. So we come in here, do the same thing. Paint black. Go from there. And then if I want to get fancy, I want my type to be in front. I want the N to be behind the thumb, so I'll just go to my type layer, hit my mask button, and again, just erase. I'm erasing my type to reveal the thumb. All right, again, if I had time, I would make a path and just make a perfect selection around that thumb, but in this case, I'm just going to go like this.
Question.
Yes?
Could you use the direct select tool to select the hand and mask it in front of the text?
So the direct, like you mean, because there isn't a direct select tool in Photoshop?
The one underneath the magic wand.
Let's see here. Okay.
The quick selection.
Oh, quick select. I try not to use the tragic wand or the quick selection tool because honestly, you're not going to get any better control for that. You could come in here and use quick selection, but again, quick selection is only going to make a selection. It's not going to deal with your layer issues. So even if you use a quick selection tool instead of the tragic wand, you still want to go to a mask so you can get that interaction with those layers. You have to think in layers in Photoshop in order to get the layers to interact. There's no tools that will let you do that. Does that make sense? Cool. The question actually was, what about the quick selection tool, which is under here? I kind of stopped. Once you start using the pen tool for everything and layer masks, no matter what tools Photoshop comes out with, I tend to just use pen tool and masks for everything. Go from there. All right. So finally, we want to add a little shading. I might even come here to my logo, and I double-clicked and brought up layer styles. I rarely ever use layer styles. Most layer styles are crap, okay? You don't want to use them, but there is a nice gradient overlay button where you can come in here very quickly. It's in multiply mode, and I can come in here and add shading and lighting to that layer. So I don't even consider gradient overlay a layer style because it's just really handy lighting. I can come in here and put it in overlay mode and change the way that's going to look. And then finally, if I want to have some, shadows being cast on the hands, I would just go in there with a black brush and paint some shadows rather than trying to do anything else fancy with it. All right, 3 more minutes left. We'll save that. Running down our last 5 things. Textures with clipping groups. This one is just like the one we did before, but, wow, that was weird. Oh, I'm in the wrong layer. There we go. With this one, if I want to just put this texture inside this entire shape, I don't actually have to use layer mask for that. If I take my metal tool here, and option click between the layers, it's going to create a clipping group where that you can see that metal texture now is clipped or cropped inside the layer below it, right? Option click between the layers. Bloop. It makes a little sound if you listen. Bloop. And, go from there. All right. And then so again, now I can come in here and play with my blending modes, and in 3 seconds I was able to add textures to my work. Now the only difference here is, it's over the entire thing. But if I want to get even crazier, add a layer mask to my clipping group. Oh my gosh. Grab a gradient and then use my gradient to fade my texture that's in a clipping group that's in my regular layer. Yeah, that's cool. That'll work. So everything stacks, everything overlaps. It just takes practice and push-ups to get it the way you want it to go. All right. Moving very quickly.
If you wanted to illustrate a children's book, what would you prefer, Photoshop or Illustrator?
Pen and paper. You start there, right? Sorry, it's not the answer they're going to want, but you do your illustration work and your idea work on paper and pen, and then transfer it to either, right? Illustrator is going to give you that vector look, and I've read a million children's books in my lives, even before I had children, and for some reason, that's my reading level, and some of them want that very crisp, clean look, and then other ones are very artsy, and you have the grit of the illustration there. So if you have to pick your style of illustration that you're going for, and then use the right tool for that. But if you have bad drawings, you're going to get bad illustration no matter what you do in Photoshop and Illustrator, right? Now, again, I'm not a great traditional artist. I can make some bad drawings, and I just keep working and working and working until they're good, and then I can polish them in Illustrator and Photoshop because I've been using them a long time. But you got to start with some good drawings and good ideas, and then you go from there. So I hope I wasn't trying to be snarky with my response. Go from there. But yeah, always start with something good here. So this is the example. I just grabbed 2 things that I had on my computer, and I was like, okay, make up an example on the fly. So in this one, I have my pub logo, and I want it to go behind the apple juice that we have there. And I think I might have done this in high school one time. And I want it to distort behind that object. So first of all, I'm going to have to make a very quick, and I'm going to do this so fast that it's going to be a little rough, but I'm going to take a path. Because basically whoa, don't open my email. You don't want to see that. I quit. Okay, that's what it says. All right, there you go. So I'm going to very quickly take my path and you know what's crazy is Photoshop 2018 changed the way the pen tool's working because I'm getting a little freaked out. I hadn't done this example in 2018. All right, so when I make that path, it's actually going to show up in my paths palette here. That path is really just used for making selections. So I can just command-click on my path here, and now if I had taken like an extra 30 seconds, it would have been the absolute perfect thing that I have. But what I want to do is I want to be able to put the beer kind of in front of the logo, but still have the background. So I'm just going to... Here we go. Oh yeah, I'm sorry, apple juice. I'm just gonna duplicate my bar shot, and then add my mask, and now I have just that drink by itself. And now if I take my there we go. So now I can have sort of our coaster that's underneath it, but I want it to kind of be. I want to see through a little bit of it, and I want to distort it a bit. So right now I have a little bit of an issue because. I could come in here and reduce my opacity, but that's not going to give you that look. So instead of putting that logo behind the beer, I'm going to leave it in front, and I'm going to do something. I'll grab that selection, and I'm going to put the logo. I'm going to put that in a blending mode just to see how that's going to look. Okay, it's not quite. So this is when just like, when in doubt, duplicate your layer and then mess with it a little bit more. I'm going to come in here, color burn, overlay. I think the overlay is going to work, but I don't want it. I want it to only be inside that beer. So I'm going to come in here and make a selection again, hit my mask, bam. And then I'll add a little distortion, filter, distort. Now displace sounds like it would be really cool, but it's the oldest filter in the book. You hit OK, and then it asks you for a file to do this. Yeah, so you just hit cancel, and then you ignore it at that point. It actually can be powerful, but instead I'm just going to do a little, let's do a little pinch. And we'll go pinch outward. There we go. So it's kind of distorted inside there, but now I'll take my original pub logo and drag it behind that layer, and we're kind of getting the direction I want to go. I want to have these layers interact with these shapes. So I just duplicated the logo, messed with it, put it on the top, masked it to that beer. Again, that overlay mode is a little bit not what I want, so maybe soft light, or oops, wrong layer. We'll go to our, oh, that is the right layer. Multiply. That actually kind of works a little bit better. So, we can kind of get that effect. And what's nice, though, is because I was using smart objects, I can double-click on my pinch and change it any time. As long as you're applying a filter to a smart object, that filter is always non-destructible, which is really good. All right, so bam. We hit save. We close that. And then finally, we're to number 5. So painting, shadows, and highlights. Again, I'm going to show you a kind of a graphic design way of painting shadows and highlights, which is by creating a shadows and highlights layer. If you're doing a children's book, I would paint traditionally. Inside Photoshop, I would build my color layers on top of each other and just keep kind of mixing colors. But in this case, I have these vector illustrations that I've done, and I want to paint shadows and highlights. So I'm going to get rid of my mouse and just use my tablet for this. But let's just do the dragon. Because it would be the same thing. So we have, except for, I forgot that the dragon is an Illustrator file. So what I'm going to do is I'll just take my dragon. Let's turn off that one. Scale it up. Because it's an Illustrator file embedded as a smart object, we can scale it up as much as we want. Now this dragon still wants to kill you. Come here, but I have that Illustrator file. I want to start painting highlights and shadows. Again, so what I'll do is I'll add a layer, and I'll call that like my shadow layer. And I'll grab a black brush. And now in Photoshop, they have some really nice brushes. They actually bought brushes from somebody who had spent his whole career building brushes in Photoshop, and they finally bought them and built them in here. But I'm going to use some default ones right now. Because we can come in here and I'm just going to grab my brush. My brush is I'm going to stay at like high opacity. Whoa, that's not the color I wanted. There we go. Something like that. But I can always, I'll build it up a little bit. I'll reduce the flow so less paint is coming out of my brush at one time. And what's nice is I can always command-click on my dragon. It makes a selection. So now I won't paint outside the lines, because that's something I do all the time. And I think I'm going to go back to just a soft brush. So again, I'll come in here and I'll start painting some shadows. And I'll kind of go overboard a little bit. And then I can drop it in multiply mode, reduce its opacity. And again, what's even better is I use my pen tool to make selections of different pieces. But in this case, I'm just going to eyeball it. And do a quick sort of pass. That was a little too much there. But I just want to have a little shadows, a little highlights. Probably underneath here. something like that. And then I'll just make a new layer, call that my highlights, and drop that in screen mode. And then again, instead of black, I'll paint white and kind of paint those highlights. Now, here's the little rub here. This is a cheat because I'm not actually mixing colors here. I'm just kind of brightening those colors. In reality, what I should be doing is mixing up a lighter shade of red and kind of blending it in here. But I'll do these kind of quick passes a lot with these graphics. Oops. To come in here. And then again, if it's too much, just reduce the opacity and go from there. Now, if you want to get really fancy, I'll actually go to Edit Fill, make a layer, go to Edit Fill, and fill this layer with 50% gray. 50% gray is a magical color because in screen mode and in blending modes, 50% gray disappears. So what's kind of cool is I can come in here on one layer, I can put this in like maybe like hard light, well, overlay mode, and I can use burn and dodge. This is a kind of very old school technique. I can go and burn and dodge, and actually I can hold down Option. I'll hide those layers. And I can come in here and start. I can. Hold on. There we go. So I can start doing highlights. Let me increase my exposure. There we go. Some highlights and shadows all on one layer. And again, I'm going to do that quick. And then, let me make a little more highlights. Then I'll experiment with blending modes. Hard light, overlay. That's not working in this case. Vivid light. Ooh, that's kind of fun. So now I can come in here and sort of paint and shade those shapes sort of however I want just by using burn and dodge all in one layer, right? So rush to the end. I knew I was running out of time, so I did a quick one. Just pretend the killer monster there is shaded beautifully. And that kind of is the end of the 5 things. Are there any questions from the online group?
No, we were going through them as you were going through.
Excellent. Any questions from campus? Yes, sir.
On number 4.
Mm-hmm. I can't tell you what I did because I was making it up, so I'll pretend.
Question though, so if you took the circle, you can make that appear like it was on the glass, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah, like basically I would distort it and bulge it so it lines up with what I perceive as the glass. The trick with that is you might want to get a little etching, so you might then do some shadows and highlights and paint some like etching highlights, because like when something gets etched on glass, don't spend a lot of time at a bar. Just spend a lot of time looking at a glass, for that. And and you'll notice that like when they etch on glass, it picks up some interesting highlights along the edges, very sharp highlights. So you kind of do that, and you could even get that etching look with a technique like that. But it's just stacking. I went a little bit crazy with it, but it's just stacking the layers and distorting the layers to what you can do. Yeah.
What is the best advice you can give someone? I learned a couple things here.
Mm-hmm.
I really want to dive into Photoshop.
So the question is, what's the best advice, if you really want to dive in, okay? The trick with Photoshop is there's a couple things you can do. Like I taught using Photoshop to graphic designers and motion graphics artists for over 10 years before my current role. So my job was to learn every little tiny thing. When I would hire people to come teach at Full Sail and they'd been using it for 20 years, they often would be like, oh, I've never used that. Oh, I've never used that. They only use 5-10% of what they're doing because it depends on what you want to do. So like if it's more of a digital painting thing, my thing is like you got to just draw before you go into Photoshop. If it's kind of like a digital media, I want to manipulate imagery and do weird things with it, Then it's still kind of trying to figure out what the type of things you want to do. But then it's like kind of experimenting with photography, experimenting with collage type styles. It's really about really looking at styles of illustration that uses Photoshop. We use that term illustration a little too narrowly in our industry. Often you hear illustration and people think, okay, it's all about drawing the dragon, right? But in reality, this is a form of illustration. I'm creating graphics and manipulating them to illustrate a point. Well, maybe not in this case, but you get the idea. So, I would say when it comes to just the bare bones, there's some really good stuff on lynda.com. I like Deke McClellan a lot. He's a really cool guy who's on Lynda, as well as Ben Wilmore. And if I remember, Ben Wilmore lives on a bus and travels around the world or country just taking amazing photos too. So his examples on Lynda always have these amazing imagery in it. I would start there just to understand how Photoshop works, because if you can understand how Photoshop works, you understand how graphics work, right? And if you understand how graphics work, then when you start doing compositing in Maya or in Nuke or in other programs, you're like, oh, this is how graphics work, and you can do some very interesting things with it. Yeah? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the question is, he's limited to his iPhone for his photography work. For a lot of what you do here, that's all you need. I hate to say it. Like now, for photography, obviously, I'm not going to go walk into a photography gig and pull out my phone, even though I've known people who've done it. But what you're going to really do is, your phone's going to be, it's going to be enough for getting it into Photoshop and playing with it. If you want to come hang out with us in our photography class and from digital media or digital arts and design and shoot with us for a day, that would be cool, and you can use our equipment. But for the most part, your camera's going to be plenty good. Yes, sir.
The image you had with the hands.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any way, when you use the gradient, to give the circular to the direction of light to make it look spherical?
So the spherical thing, the option now is, I would say, just go do it in 3D. Right, use. Actually, there are some 3D things inside Photoshop now where you can actually, build a sphere, but it's very basic. You could trick it with distortion to get it more of a spherical shape. But these day and age, if I was going to do like a professional photography gig that involved that, if I couldn't do the 3D element, I might get somebody who could. I might talk to a computer animation student or a DAD student and say, hey, can you help me make this thing? And then do the compositing in there. Just because it's not as hard as you think, even if you have the Creative Cloud suite, After Effects now has a version of Cinema 4D that comes in it, and you can inside After Effects render things out and take it into Photoshop. So you actually have a free version of a 3D program if you have the Creative Cloud. So you can do things like that. Oh, and for online, the question was about actually doing a spherical logo as opposed to just an extruded logo. Cool. Thank you so much. I appreciate if you're letting me ramble for this amount of time. I'll be up here if anybody has any questions. Otherwise, have a good day. Thank you.